embers diagrams, the darker the red, the higher is the scientific evidence of high risk. And you see on the x-axis here, global mean temperature rise levels. So you see how the arrow goes from high temperatures, 5-6 degrees, down to towards 2 degrees Celsius over the past 20 years. What this shows is a scientific assessment as science advances, assesses that the risk of large-scale discontinuities, meaning pushing big systems away from stability, was for 20 years ago assessed at best to be a risk that would not occur until we reached 5-6 degrees Celsius of global mean temperature rise, but today is down between 2 and 2.5. So past 2 degrees, we have today much higher scientific confidence that we then risk destabilizing functioning of the Earth system. But it's an advancements in science. The more we learn, the more reason for concern we have. Next. So this is something that we are spending a lot of efforts today in the earth sciences to understand the tipping elements, the global commons that regulates the state of the climate system. We know of roughly 15 big tipping element systems like the ice sheets and the rainforest and the ocean circulation of heat. Here are the 9 systems that we have signs scientifically that they are starting to show indications of instability, meaning that they might be approaching tipping points. Now, that is one concern, and the IPCC actually highlights several of these, pointing at the Arctic sea ice, pointing at the Greenland ice sheet, pointing at the Atlantic overturning of heat, the AMOC, pointing at the Amazon rainforest, pointing at the West Antarctic ice shelf. But what I find most important here is that the frontier of science is more and more exploring and seeing indications of the connectivity between this, which are shown here on the arrows. For example, that when Greenland ice sheet melts very rapidly, releasing cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, this slows down the AMOC, the overturning of heat, which pushes down the whole intercontinental transit, the whole monsoon systems across the equator, which can explain why we have a higher frequency of droughts and forest fires over the Amazon rainforest. And moreover, we have surface waters being held, warmer surface waters being held in the Southern Ocean, which can explain why the West Antarctic ice shelf melts faster because of the connections all the way up to the Arctic. So these cascading interactions is something we need to understand and forms part of what was discussed earlier by Maria, the necessity for precaution. Next, please. Now, this, next slide, please. This requires a guiding principle, and one of those guiding principles is the science around the planetary boundaries, where we try to scientifically understand where are the risks of nonlinear dynamics and interactions and feedbacks that can move the planet away from basic stable life support, and that is one of the guiding principles we now need to have with us also, I would argue, in a Stockholm+50 context. Now, the interactions between climate and the life support systems is increasingly well understood. Here is just one example between IPBES and IPCC, where the biodiversity and climate agendas are increasingly showing to be fundamentally interdependent. Just to give you one example, we have today all the evidence that if it hadn't been for the nature climate sinks, meaning carbon sinks in nature, we would have already have passed 1.5 degrees Celsius. IPCC concludes clearly that 56% of our emissions are absorbed in ocean and on land. Next, please. So when we look at the trajectory we're following, we have this classic hockey stick today showing how we are deviating away from the state of the Earth system as we have been benefited from it over the past 10,000 years. This is from the IPCC confirming this conclusion, which I think is really important that we have that confidence today. Next. And in that analysis is just a confirmation that the IPCC also lists the risk of long-term commitments across permafrost, sea level rise, ocean heat, and also the risks of biosphere shifts. But also, if you take the next slide, on the risks of crossing tipping points. So this is the first time we really see how tipping points and long-term commitments are being entering even the baseline assessment of the IPCC analysis. Take the next slide. So in that sense, we need to, you can take the next slide. This is an old version, I see. I come to this kind of tying it together with the previous presentation, that a new definition of sustainable development is needed in the Anthropocene at this risk of destabilizing life supports, which I would define as prosperity and equity within a resilient and stable Earth system, within planetary boundaries. That, I think, is what I hope will be increasing in the table in this transformative moment that we've reached now. Next, please. So if you take the next slide, please. Yeah, we show more and more evidence that this is being understood. We recently carried out a big opinion poll across all the G20 countries, showing that 73% of citizens are concerned about crossing tipping points. So not only concerned about climate change, but also concerned about destabilizing life support systems. So there's a lot of support for this transformative change. Next slide, please. And the journey is well known. We need to land at a net zero world economy by 2050. This is the IPCC. Next slide. And that is not only about decarbonizing the world economy, energy system in gray here, it's also a transition in a full sustainability sense of the food system, scaling negative emission technologies in orange, but also keeping the nature climate sinks, the negative sinks, the carbon sinks in nature intact on land and in oceans. So there's no Paris landing unless we take on a full systems transformation. And that is something that is so seldom recognized, that the planetary boundaries is really necessary for every single transition we're talking about to deliver both the CBD and on the Paris Agreement. Next. So with that, I'm closing and handing back just to put the Economist slide on the table, just to show the drama. So this is what the regions in the world are facing. That net zero 2050 requires from us to follow the lines and the dotted straight lines here. And just look at the US and the European Union having pledged net zero by 2050. It's a transformative journey over the next 30 years. Look at China, that has now pledged to have net zero no later than 2060, which is not even following the necessities in science, but it's an immense journey that now has to be urgently embarked on. All countries in the world by Glasgow needs to adopt exactly the same pathway. Otherwise, we fail on 1.5. So it just shows that this is no longer a standing by the side position. This is the time to really stand up and start delivering. So with that, I hand back to Helena and Stanley, and thank you very much. I think you can take the next final slide there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Johan. We wish we would have time for questions, but unfortunately we're a little bit late in the program. But a very important presentation that you made, and yeah, this is a serious situation we're in. So we really need to see action.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will, unfortunately, due to time restraints, we need to continue with our next keynote speaker, which is Ms. Johanna Lissinger-Peitz.
So a quick introduction. Ms. Ambassador Johanna Lissinger-Peitz has been appointed to lead the daunting task of preparing for Stockholm+50 as a UN conference. She is also has been a lead negotiator for the Swedish government within the EU and within the United Nations climate change processes. She has been at the Swedish mission to the UN in New York City, where she led the work together with India on industrial transition track ahead of the climate summit in September 2019. So over to Ambassador Johanna Lissinger-Peitz.
Johanna, Ambassador.
Distinguished delegates, participants to the Stockholm+49 summit, make 2022 a game changer. I can't think of a better title for the summit you have convened here today. Make 2022 a game changer. The Secretary General of the United Nations called the IPCC report a code red for humanity. That is a clear signal that we can't continue on the same path. We need a game changer. We need a just, inclusive, and peaceful transition that leaves no one behind and that creates a healthy planet for the prosperity of all. The coming year will be pivotal for people, planet, and prosperity, with major decisions for climate, for nature, and for pollution. Today, I'm very grateful to be addressing you on the topic of Stockholm+50. As hosts, we will strive to work together with all interested partners through collaborative and inclusive efforts of joint action-oriented solutions to our common global goals. 3 leadership dialogues will make up the very heart of Stockholm+50. The first one, reflecting on the urgent need for actions to achieve a healthy planet for the prosperity of all. This leadership dialogue will focus on transformative actions, moving beyond incremental change to systematic change. The ambition is to redefine our relationship with nature by taking further steps to achieve net zero carbon, nature positive, and zero pollution societies. The second dialogue, achieving a sustainable and inclusive recovery from COVID-19. This is where the short-term actions needed to recover and build forward from the pandemic are brought together. We must rebalance development to address inequity, wasteful consumption, unequal opportunity, and relations with nature. The third dialogue, on the theme accelerating implementation of the environment dimension of sustainable development in the context of Decade of Action and Delivery and Sustainable Recovery. This is about focusing on the means to implement commitments and actions, ensuring delivery on the 2030 Agenda, the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, and the national implementation plans of the emerging global biodiversity framework. On this journey, we have partnered with Kenya, and let me take the opportunity here today to also congratulate UNEP as the focal point for this meeting, and Iner Andersson has just recently been appointed as the Secretary General of the conference. To conclude, let me share with you 3 keywords as we see as illustrating how we see engagement pathways for Stockholm. Implementation, interconnectivity, and intergeneration. Implementations. In many areas, we already have the blueprints for action. Delivery on the ground will be key. So let us use the format of Stockholm to have an honest discussion. Transformation, in some cases, will come with a cost. However, it also brings opportunities for social and economic development. Interconnectivity stands for 2 things. One is the interconnectivity between different policy areas. The second is the interconnectivity between governments, civil society, and business. We need to work together across policy areas, across sectors, if we are to come up with the solutions we are so much in need of. The last I is the intergeneration. The world today has the biggest youth population in history. Much of the youth, if not most, do live in developing countries. We can't speak about the present or the future without a meaningful involvement of youth. Preparing for Stockholm+50, we want to hear from you. We have an opportunity and a common responsibility to work towards a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, leaving no one behind. We are seeking a bottom-up approach that reflects the richness and diversity of voices and perspectives on the planet. I hope that today is just the start of a conversation on how we make Stockholm+50 a success, working together. I thank you.
words, implementation, interconnectivity, and intergenerational. These are the words that we would like to see action coming out of Stockholm+50 next year. And now we are going to
next part of
next part of
the session.
the session, yeah?
Yeah, or the summit, where we will have thematic interventions around different topics. And we are very glad and honored to have with us as the first presenter, Professor Will Steffen. He will give an introduction on the theme Science of Urgency and the topic Earth System Science and Emergency. Will Steffen is an Earth System Science. He is a counselor on the public-funded Climate Council of Australia that delivers independent expert information about climate change. He's also an emeritus professor at the Australian National University, Canberra, and senior fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden, and a member of Anthropocene Working Group. From 1998 to mid-2004, Professor Steffen was Executive Director of the International Geosphere and Biosphere Program based in Stockholm. His research interests span a broad range within Earth system science with an emphasis on sustainability and climate change. So very welcome, Will. The screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Helena and Stanley, and thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to talk to you today. My talk will follow on very closely from the one that you've heard from Johan Rockström, so perhaps I might be able to save a wee bit of time by going through and emphasizing the additional points that I would like to make. So if you could please put up my slide presentation on the main screen. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about why we really need to act now. I think Johan made that point that we've been talking about this for 20, 30, or maybe even 50 years, but time has run out now. And as you can see from that photo, this is my home city of Canberra. Time has run out for us too. We narrowly avoided a massive fire that would have destroyed much of our city. But this is not unusual. Things are happening to the Earth system extremely rapidly. So the next slide, please. This slide is one similar to what Johan showed, but it's a 2,000-year temperature record of planet Earth. So you see those colored lines going for 2,000 years. There was very little change in temperature, maybe 1 or 2 tenths of a degree. But look at that large black spike at the end. Can you just hit the next button, please? That spike there is the human influence, and that's putting it on a longer-term time frame to show you just how radical, how dramatic this change is to the Earth system. So if we look at some rates of change on the next slide, please, we can see what this really means. So the rate at which we are pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere over the last 2 decades has reached 100 times the maximum rate during the last deglaciation, the last time CO2 went up rapidly. Over the last half century, our temperature is rising at a rate about 200 times the background rate over the last 7,000 years of the Holocene. But this last one, I think, is the most important one, that these current rates of CO2 and temperature rise are almost unprecedented in the entire 4.5 billion year geological past. We can find only one other time in the history of this planet when climate has changed this fast. That was 66 million years ago when a meteorite strike knocked out the dinosaurs. So what we're witnessing now, what we're causing now, is virtually unprecedented in the entire history of our planet. Next slide, please. Johan has showed this before, and it shows these tipping elements that we're talking about. The ice at the poles, the permafrost, ocean circulation, coral reefs, in our case here in Australia, and large biomes like the boreal and tropical forest. The point that this graph makes again is twofold. One is we can measure changes in all of these already. They are moving away from their stability zones, and they are moving towards their tipping points. And the second point, as Johan pointed out, they are connected. And like a row of dominoes, if we start one or two of them tipping, we may not be able to stop the entire set of tipping elements tipping over and basically pushing Earth into a very different state. Next one, please. So the point that this paper made, I think this is the key point. If these damaging tipping cascades can occur, and we know they can, a global tipping point cannot be ruled out. Then this indeed is an existential threat to civilization. I think this last sentence is really important. No amount of economic cost-benefit analysis is going to help us. In other words, this is a problem that cannot be solved by economics. It can't even be addressed by economics. It's an existential threat. We need to treat it as such and not as an economic problem. Next one, please. So as Johan pointed out, it's not just the physical climate system that's changing, it's also the biosphere. And that was the equivalent of the IPCC report published in 2019 by an eminent and large group of the world's best ecologists and biologists. They came up with a number of really important summary statements. I'll put 3 of them up there. Can you hit the first one, please? So nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. So that means we are changing nature, we are degrading nature, we are minimizing nature at extraordinary rates, just like the climate. Next one, please. Around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. That's around about a total of 8 or 9 million species, many within the next few decades. So we are definitely moving into already the 6th great extinction event in Earth history, but driven by us. And the last one, please. The web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. So taken together, this is telling us that human pressures on the biosphere are changing it just as rapidly as we're changing the climate system. And as Johan pointed out, these are linked. You cannot separate them. Next slide, please. This is an earlier picture of what emission reductions we need to take. It's much more simple than the IPCC emission reduction curves, but it's doing a couple of things. It's showing us why the situation is urgent, and it shows us what we need to do if we cannot learn how to take massive amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere. All the IPCC scenarios that keep us within the Paris goals assume that we can develop technologies which don't yet exist, that we can take CO2 out. What if we can't do that? What do we need to do now? Next one, please. It tells us that we must hit a 50% reduction by 2030 if we're to stabilize the climate at well below 2 degrees. So that means the emphasis is not on 2050, the emphasis is on 2030 and what we need to do before we reach the end of this decade. Next, please. And that means we actually need to hit net zero by 2040 if we are to avoid massive drawdown of CO2 in the second half of this century. So that's putting the pressure on again to say, if we only talk about net zero by 2050, that, as Johan said, is kicking the can down the road. We need to be more ambitious, and we can do that. We have the technologies to do that. We can hit net zero by 2040. Next, please. And to achieve these two, we need to get emissions going down from 2020 or from 2021 now. We cannot even delay 5 years. So basically, this is why the students are right, that this is a climate emergency, that when you work backwards from what we need to do, we have lost any excess time that we might have. We must act now, we must act decisively, and we must get emissions down this decade. Next one, please. There are solutions out there. I'm not going to go through a lot of them, but this is one of the most innovative ones. We need new economies that, of course, deal with social issues of education, food, equality, and so on. That's important. We have a lot of work to do there, but we must recognize there is a ceiling. There is a limit to how much we can push the Earth system. And our big challenge is to meet these social requirements at the same time we stabilize the Earth system. So Kate Raworth has put forward an idea, a good conceptual approach for how we need to do this. There are others out there, but the point is we have to think outside of the box, as we say, and have new innovative approaches. Next slide. So what she's thinking, or what she's talking about in terms of an economy for this century, is we need systems thinking, not simple cause-effect logic, which a lot of neoliberal economics is based on. We need to generate equity by design of the economic system. Right now, we're generating inequalities. And of course, we must regenerate the biosphere rather than exploiting it. These are fundamental changes in how we view an economic system, but they have to be made, and they have to be made quickly. The next slide, please. I'm going to conclude now by quoting some colleagues of mine. These are Indigenous people who have lived sustainably in Australia for 65,000 years and looked after this magnificent continent in a really wonderful way. But the point that they make is we have to go all the way down to our core values, what we think is important in life. And I'll just read this to you. We're only here for a short amount of time to do what we've been put here to do, which is to look after country. We're only a tool in the cycle of things. We go out into the world and help keep the balance of nature. It's a big cycle of living with the land and then eventually going back to it. Notice that Indigenous Australia has understood cycles, systems, and balance. We've forgotten that in the Western world, in the globalized world. We need to look at our Indigenous colleagues and say, we need to learn from you about the value systems that we need to take forward in the 21st century. So next one, please. Thank you very much for your attention. Again, the theme of my talk has been urgency. We are now at the fork in the road. We can choose sustainability. We can choose major changes to the way we live, the way we work, the way we think, and what we value. But there is no more time now to talk about this. We must act now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Speech, Professor Stefan. We will have a short Q&A session later on, so I hope you can stay until then. So let's continue with our next speaker.
Yes, thank you, Helena. Our next speaker is our next spot actually in this session is shared by two people, and they are going to address the rule of law in the Anthropocene. We will kickstart with Dr. Louis Kotze, who is a research professor of law at the Faculty of Law, Northwest University, South Africa, where he teaches international and African regional environmental law. He is also senior professorial fellow in Earth Systems Law at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. His research broadly encompasses three interrelated themes that he approaches from a transnational perspective: human rights, socio-ecological justice, and environmental constitutionalism, law and Anthropocene, and Earth Systems Law. Over to you, Dr. Kotze.
Thank you very much, and good day, everyone. Thank you for the very kind invitation to take part in this discussion today. I want us to use the next few minutes to reflect on how the forthcoming Stockholm Summit could be a game changer for law in the Anthropocene. And I specifically want us to think about the type of law that we want for the Anthropocene and the type of legal reforms that must be driven by the Stockholm process. Now, assuming that the forthcoming Stockholm Summit and its declaration will play an important role in shaping the future content, objectives, and form of law, as all past global environmental conferences and declarations have done, we need to use this opportunity to plead for radical legal reforms that are very much long overdue. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that what was previously regarded as impossible for society to change its ways can rapidly become possible in the face of an existential threat. In the small window of opportunity that remains, radical transformation of the law and other social regulatory institutions is the only rational response to the unfolding socio-ecological crisis. Because radical legal transformation is a massive task, I want us to start at a much more modest level by rethinking the building blocks of environmental law, as it were, namely its principles. Now, legal principles are far more widely in evidence in environmental law than in any other field of law. The principles of sustainable development, polluter pays, prevention, precaution, public participation, and so forth have evolved over the course of half a century to form a central pillar of contemporary international, regional, and domestic legal regimes. And these principles articulate collective aspirations that play an important role over the longer term, and they help to frame discussions about the future development of environmental law. Environmental law principles often have no immediate effect. They are instead focused on shaping attitudinal regularities with the possibility to influence, hopefully, over time, behavioral regularities of a more prescriptive nature. Now, environmental law principles are also central to the adjudication efforts of courts all over the world that use them to interpret, apply, and further develop environmental law. Professor Rockström has briefly referred to the decision of Neubauer by the German Constitutional Court, where the precautionary principle, for example, was used, and intergenerational equity. And also imparting something more profound about the rules that they undergird. And in line with the role of legal principles more generally, environmental law principles reveal the deeper, often hidden essence of environmental law and its core ethics and values. Now, these principles that are fully embedded in international environmental law have been the darling of scholars for many decades, with many lauding their contribution to shaping environmental law and influencing environmental governance. But a recent critical strand of scholarship questions whether many of these principles are in fact able and still appropriate to continue mediating increasingly severe human impacts on the Earth system, notably in the light of the Anthropocene trope. Now, this trope's haunting visions of a looming sixth mass extinction event and of fast approaching planetary boundaries, as we've heard in the previous discussions, suggests that environmental law, as a key social regulatory institution, is not suitably configured to confront a very powerful human and its assumed telluric force. So the Anthropocene trope reveals the human as a veritable Prometheus unbound, as it were, while at once illuminating the complicity of environmental law in ongoing failed efforts to restrain human activity and to address the Anthropocene's crisis of human hierarchy and its socio-ecological crisis emanating from a deeply intertwined Earth system. The Anthropocene trope also clearly foregrounds the disconnection between environmental law and Earth system governance challenges. And because environmental law's principles are key foundational building blocks of environmental law, they, I think, are guilty by association in environmental law's unsuccessful efforts to restrain the powerful human. So I want us to start a conversation about the type of legal principles that are more appropriate for the purpose of law in the Anthropocene. And I will try and situate this discussion within the conceptual confines of Earth system law, which has recently been proposed as a new way of thinking about the law in the Anthropocene. Earth system law more fully embraces a systems perspective that is anchored in the Anthropocene's planetary context, and it's a perspective that we believe is also better attuned to the new regulatory realities, normative and transformative demands, and perhaps more importantly, the ethical implications of the Anthropocene. So I will argue that Earth system law offers a unique opportunity to think about a new set of legal principles for the Anthropocene, alongside the Earth system metaphor and the complex contemporary governance challenges emanating from a complex Earth system. And my argument is based on two assumptions. First, law is a living and ever-changing phenomenon that can and must continuously adapt to new circumstances and realities. Law is not set in stone. It can and must change. So as a result, a legal system may very well shift from one set of principles to another set of principles over time. Second, legal principles are special norms that lie at the core or the heart of a body of law. Because they are reflective of its essence, distilling a set of principles would be a necessary first foundational step to start thinking about the design and content of a new legal paradigm for the Anthropocene. So perhaps more critically, I would suggest that most of environmental law's current set of principles has failed us and that they have become inappropriate for Earth system governance in the Anthropocene. Environmental law continues to merely offer minimalist alternatives that are facilitated through, most importantly and problematically, I think, its mantra principle of sustainable development. At its core, the essence of the principle of sustainable development is to balance social, economic, and environmental concerns in a politically appeasing way, as we know. Sustainable development has been instrumental in keeping environmental protection on the international political agenda as a concern rhetorically shared and endlessly restated by states and their corporations, while it very explicitly must not be allowed to inhibit social and economic development. Now, to achieve this objective, the principle of sustainable development is deliberately vague, and its threshold of achievement is not set very high. It must merely balance interests, not pursue planetary integrity. Now, while the intention might have been different at the time of its conception in the early 1970s, sustainable development in its present form is not a socio-ecologically friendly principle. It remains an elusive ideal that should be achieved through discretionary, non-interventionist, and, let's be honest, politically inoffensive global governance strategies such as the Sustainable Development Goals. This most recent new liberal embodiment of international environmental law's core principle is intrinsically incapable of comprehensively addressing socio-ecological vulnerability. Sustainable development is therefore not an appropriate legal solution for the Anthropocene, I believe. And I fully agree with Professor Rockström that we need a new definition of sustainable development for the purpose of the Anthropocene, because in its present form, sustainable development is too deeply implicated in the many social and legal systems, institutions, and practices that have created the unsustainable, uneven, and unjust world that we live in. Perversely, its influence is inversely proportionate to its protection of a vulnerable living order. Sustainable development is business as usual. It is a conservative, if not reactionary, ideology at odds with the radical transformations urgently required to confront the Anthropocene's rapidly unfolding crisis. With few exceptions, other principles of environmental law that operate within the ambit of sustainable development and that often departs from the principle of sustainable development are equally non-offensive, politically appeasing, and biased towards promoting new liberal economic development for the benefit of a privileged few. For example, the polluter pays principle has been unable to guide the creation of truly ambitious anti-pollution laws across the globe that can actually prevent corporations, many of them which have now morphed into powerful private sector quasi-states, to cause pollution and to profit therefrom. The inability of the precautionary approach and public trusteeship principles to shape the attitudes and behaviors of states that destroy their own natural resources and the livelihoods of indigenous people in the name of economic development is a continuing worrying trend. And one observes this, for example, with the principle of sovereignty over natural resources. The Brazilian government's ravaging of the Amazon rainforest to promote agriculture and economic development is a case in point, where the principle of sovereignty over natural resources is explicitly used to justify ecological destruction in pursuit of striking a misguided and economically biased imbalance between environmental, social, and economic consideration. Another major concern is that environmental law does not provide any principles that are both sensitive to the Earth's systematicity and that aims to facilitate governance of complex, intertwined Earth system aspects, processes, and components. The existing environmental law regime merely leads to problem shifting as a result, and it severely limits environmental law's ability to govern an interactive Earth system alongside new and innovative insights from Earth system science, as we've just heard from Professors Rockström and Steffen. In other words, there is no principle currently in environmental law that sufficiently connects insights from Earth system science with the law, and that translates these into legal terms. So with very few exceptions, I think that the principles of environmental law that we have not been able to significantly influence the transactions that lead to Earth system destruction. They've merely masked the negative externalities caused by these transactions. Because as a key part of environmental law, they have been organized as an additional layer for specifically designed not to interfere with the possibility of continuing the transaction. So in my view, a main objective. Sorry,
Thank
just
you very much. We are running over time a little bit, so if you could conclude it in 30 seconds, it would be perfect.
I will do so. So in my view, a main objective of the Stockholm Summit must be to defamiliarize ourselves with the existing principles and create new principles, a type of law for the Anthropocene. And the assumption is that whatever new legal principles are developed for the Anthropocene, these principles must answer to one or more of the following three imperatives. And I conclude with this. One, they must be able to restrain geologically powerful humans, such as the principles of degrowth, decarbonization, or net zero emissions, even in dubio pro natura. Second, they must be congruent with the Earth system architecture and its governance challenges, such as the principles of interconnectivity and complexity. And third, they must inaugurate a new planetary ethic, such as principles of humility, planetary integrity, and planetary justice. And all of this translate into three categories of principles that we need to start to think urgently about: behavioral principles, architectural principles, and ethical principles that are in fact appropriate for the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. And the next speaker for this session is going to be Makane Moise Mbengu, who is Professor of International Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Geneva and Director of Department of International Law and International Organizations. He is also an affiliate professor at Sciences Po Paris International School of Law. Professor Mbengu acts as counsel in disputes before international courts and tribunals, in particular before the International Court of Justice and in investment cases, and as an advisor for governments. He is also involved in negotiations of several international investments agreements in Africa. He is author of several publications and books.
So
Thank
very
you, Professor.
welcome, Professor Mbengu. We look forward to your speech.
Problems of connections.
Thank you. You are on now.
Okay, I hope it works because I've been having problems for the last 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Anna and Stanley, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I was being asked to address the role of principles in international environmental law. Let me start by saying that the Stockholm Conference in 1972, as we know, led to the adoption of the very first declaration of principles in international environmental law. And that declaration of principles, as we also know, marked the birth of international environmental law. So what does it mean? It means that from its very inception, international environmental law was actually inextricably linked to principles, and that from the very inception of international environmental law, there was this idea that the effectiveness of international environmental law would depend on principles, and the principle that would be shaped for global environment governance. If we pay attention to the chapeau of the Stockholm Declaration says that the principles that are contained in that declaration are principles that shall guide, that shall inspire and guide the peoples of the world in the preservation and enhancement of the human environment. And actually, those principles since 1972 have indeed inspired and guided the peoples of the world. If we just take as an example Principle 1 of the Stockholm Declaration, which actually launched the famous right to a healthy environment, even if the Stockholm Declaration was quite elusive in how it referred to the right to a healthy environment, there's no doubt that Principle 1 launched this idea of a right to a healthy environment. Principle 1 has guided and has inspired many peoples in this world. Let's think about what happened in 1981 in Africa when the Charter on Human and People's Right in Africa was adopted, and Article 24 of that Charter referred to a right to a satisfactory environment. Let's think also about another regional moment, very important moment, when in 1987 in the Americas, the San Salvador Protocol to the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights was adopted, and the San Salvador Protocol incorporated in its Article 11 the right to a healthy environment. Let's think also about how many domestic legislation, many domestic constitutions throughout the world incorporated the right to a healthy environment. And then recently, finally, we've been having the Human Rights Council recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a fundamental human right. So it shows that these principles have really inspired and guided the peoples of the world. But I don't think that we can reduce the potential of the principles of international environmental law to their guiding and inspiring function. Principles of international environmental law can play a much more important role for the governance of the global environment. And in my view, there are four main other roles that show the importance of these principles, and I would like to emphasize those four main other functions briefly now. The first other important function that these principles are playing is what I would call a trend-setting function, function. Principles of international environmental law, they set normative trends. What does it mean? It means that these principles, they orientate the way how human activities and state activities have to be implemented in order to preserve the environment. And international courts and tribunals have actually recognized this trend-setting function of principles of international environmental law. One example that comes to my mind is the example of the award that was rendered by the famous Iron Rhine Tribunal in 2005 in a dispute between Belgium and the Netherlands, where the Iron Rhine Tribunal actually declared, and I quote, that today international law requires the integration of appropriate measures of environmental protection in the design and implementation of economic activities. This is what the tribunal said. And the tribunal deduced that trend from a principle of international environmental law. Principle 4 of the Rio Declaration, which, as we know, contains or reflects the principle of sustainable development. So the finding that this tribunal made about what international law is requiring today in terms of integrating appropriate measures of environmental protection in the design and implementation of economic activities came from a trend. And the tribunal actually even used the word trend to say that Principle 4 was reflecting a trend that would have, of course, to guide state and human activities. So that's the first main function that I think we need to keep in mind. Second very important function of principles of international environmental law, a gap filling function. A gap filling function. We know that we have many environmental treaties or many environmental provisions in legal instruments that are not always that sophisticated, that are not that always complete in terms of scope. Principles of international environmental law allows those environmental treaties, in particular multilateral environmental agreements, to be living instruments, to allow them to deploy continuing and continuous effects in the system. Here again, one example I would think about, let's just think about Article 192 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that says that states have the obligation, the duty to protect and preserve the marine environment. Well, we have that duty, but what has allowed this duty to preserve and protect the marine environment to develop, to be a living duty, are the principles of international environmental law. International courts and tribunals have quite often refer to principles of international environmental law in order to explain to state what is the meaning of the duty to preserve and protect the environment, and not only the environment under jurisdiction of states, but also the environment beyond national jurisdictions, like, for instance, the deep seabed area, which is common heritage of mankind. But the gap filling of principles of international, the gap filling function of principles of international environmental law is not just relevant for environmental treaties or environmental provisions. It is also relevant for human rights treaties. It is also relevant for trade treaties. It is also relevant for investment treaties. So it is relevant for non-environmental treaties. We know that human rights can be impacted by environmental environmental risk. We know that trade can impact or can affect the environment. We know that investment can affect the environment. So what does it mean? It means that even in those other fields that are not necessarily under global environment governance, we need those principles of international environmental law that would allow to fill the gaps in those fields, how to interpret human rights in a more environmental friendly manner, how to interpret trade in a more environmentally friendly manner, how to interpret investment in a more environmentally friendly manner. We need principles for that. And this brings me to the third main function of this principle that I would call the coherence building function. The coherence building function. I'm not going to insist very much on that, but we all know that global environmental governance is fragmented. And the reason why it's fragmented is because we have all those environmental treaties that are very sectorial in nature, that are very piecemeal in nature. And so we cannot have effective environmental governance if all those sectors of environmental protection are not connected and interconnected. And principles of international environmental law can play this role of bringing more coherence between these different layers of environmental governance, between these different layers of international environmental law. Last but not least, the fourth main function, fourth main role that principles of international environmental law are playing is what I would call norm-evolving function. Principles of international environmental law have allowed to interpret, to expand traditional rules of customary international law, traditional rules of general international law in a more environmental perspective, in a more environmental dimension. Let's just think about the traditional duty of due diligence. We all know, we all have heard about due diligence. Due diligence is really as international law is, but principles of international environmental law have allowed to reinterpret today due diligence in the context of environmental protection and what exercising due diligence would mean for states if they really want to preserve the environment, how prevention would interplay with due diligence, how precaution would interplay with due diligence, how the duty to conduct an environmental impact assessment would interplay with due diligence. So this is what I call the norm-evolving function of principles of international environmental law. So this brings me to my conclusion to say that we see that principles of international environmental law, they have a huge potential. They have a huge potential to contribute to more effectiveness in global environment governance. But for that, if we really want these principles to fulfill what I would call their normative destiny, we need to make sure that these principles are more predictable in their content, are more predictable in their contours, are more predictable in their scope, are more predictable when it comes to their statutes. We cannot reasonably think that principles of international environmental law can really contribute to effective global environment governance if we do not reinforce the structure, the texture of these principles of international environmental law. And the last point I wanted just to make is that we need also not to see these principles in a static perspective. These principles are dynamic. These principles were never meant to be frozen. So what does it mean? It means that we need to always rethink what these principles of environmental law should be about. We cannot say that what was done in Stockholm in 1972 or in Rio in 1992 is the end of the history of international environmental law. There are new principles that have emerged, the principle of resilience, the principle of non-regression. All those principles today need to be acknowledged, need to benefit from universal recognition from the international community. And I really hope that 22 will be a game changer for that, because we cannot have an healthy planet without an healthy international environmental law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for unpacking the principles for us. And now we are going to move on to the next speaker, Elena.
Yes. And we have the privilege to introduce to you Ms. Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, who will speak on the theme Regulating Economy, Building for a Better Economy. On the topic, can the market save the planet? How best to regulate the market? And Ms. Sandrine Dixon de Clèves is currently the co-president of the Club of Rome and divides her time between lecturing, facilitating change in business and policy models, and advisory work. She holds several advisory positions for the European Commission, chair expert groups on economic and societal impact of research and innovation, assembly member, climate mitigation and adaptation emission, and many, many more. And the list goes on. So to save some time, I will go straight over to welcoming you, Ms. Sandrine Dixon de Clèves. Thank you very much for being with us, and very welcome to Stockholm+49 Summit. We look forward to hearing you speak.
Thank you so much, Helena and Stanley, and it's a pleasure being with you, because this is a very important time. We are all speaking about the decisive decade, but as you know as well, that actually next year is the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference, and many of the opening speakers and now the most recent speakers have referred to it. What happened 50 years ago is also, and I'd like the first slide to please be put up of my presentation, if possible. There we go. At the same time as the Stockholm Conference was actually the publication of the seminal report, The Limits to Growth. And that's why a lot of what I will be speaking about today is exactly what you have just indicated, but taking it from a slightly different perspective, which is 50 years ago, we talked about the limits to growth. We were already speaking around the need to fit ourselves as a human species within the planetary boundaries, exactly as Johan Rockström has now been pushing all of us to be thinking about for many years. And if we go to the next slide, you will actually see that the way in which the limits to growth put forward its scenarios, and let's remember, this was the first systems dynamic model. And we read the first chapters, and it is quite a shock to realize that we could actually be saying the same thing now today. If you look at what we said when we opened up that first seminal report, taking into consideration all the business as usual scenarios, one of the authors made it very clear This supreme effort is a challenge for our generation. It cannot be passed on to the next. The effort must be resolutely undertaken without delay, and significant redirection must be achieved during this decade. The redirection that was mentioned there was that if we did not address population growth, in also the way in which humanity was consuming precious resources and moving far beyond the capacity, the carrying capacity of the earth, we would see a series of tipping points. That particular quote we could apply today, because we know that we must now run, not walk, in order to change the course of history. Next slide, please. So it's very important that we are actually on this day, just before COP26, in preparation for the 50th anniversary of Stockholm and the limits to growth, take into consideration the global tipping points that are facing us, the global instabilities of the social system, the global instabilities of the political system, the fact that every decision is from a short-term perspective, except for a few governments that look at long-term planning. The economic system, which is very much planned around a capital model, which is pushing for GDP growth rather than an understanding that we cannot continue to produce in the same manner. And of course, our global commons, which again has been mentioned many times. If you move to the next slide, we must start to look at the way in which we fit all of our consumption patterns, the way in which we live within the planetary boundaries, as was so clearly indicated by Johan Rockström. Next slide. But we must also take into consideration that we will have social tipping points, many more, before we actually have environmental collapse. Mass movements have already started, whether it be the youth movement or the Black Lives Matter movement or other movements which are creating a destabilization effect. Political progress is not moving fast enough. Political will is stopping us from adopting the technologies that we must put in place and the new market forces that will ensure that we decarbonize at the pace that's necessary. And of course, we need to take into consideration technological disruption. The aim here, and again, the predictability of those scenarios already 50 years ago, was not 100%, but what it did say was we would start to see tipping points around the 2020s. And here we are in 2021 with the greatest pandemic that the entire globe has ever felt, with climate effects clearly growing as long as the effects of biodiversity loss. So we must look at zero carbon alongside zero loss of nature, zero poverty, and zero pandemics. And a lot of what the regulatory professors and speakers before me spoke of must be put into an international, national, and regional construct to enable this shift to happen. Next slide, please. Because what we need to do is clearly now shift our pathways of development through a lens of reaching the planetary boundaries. And what we have done with a new initiative working directly with the Potsdam Institute and Johan Rockström is to model 5 key pathways in the interrelationships between those pathways, what we call the turnarounds, in order to ensure that we truly do put forward the new economy, the new market, which will service people, planet, and prosperity. Next slide, please. The key focus is we must look at 21st century transformational economics. We need to look at a pluralistic approach. There are many different analyses. There are many different proposals and models. The well-being economic model, the degrowth model, the green growth model, ecological economics, donut economics, and beyond GDP. Many of them are bringing forward different types of new indicators for better human development. Next slide, please. And the key point is to say we need to look at an end point. The end point is we must turn around the current pace of our economies, the current focus of our economies, to focus on new types of development. To do that, we have looked at 5 key turnarounds: energy, food, poverty, equality, and family. Next slide, please. And the way in which we look at the juxtaposition, and I'm going to ask you to keep on tapping on the slide because it's going to be a bit difficult now, is to look at what is our ultimate focus for well-being economics. Next, we want to make sure that we have returns and savings. Is it not working in terms of the slide? There we go. Okay. So we need to look at this model as what is the produced capital, what is the natural capital, and what is the human and social capital. And it was already again referenced in one of the last presentations that it is the flows and the stocks and the assets between all of these that are going to make us put in place a new type of economic and financial model which will service people, planet, and prosperity. So look at economic growth differently. Bring in green growth and bring in healthy growth. We need to have a productive economy, not just a produced economy, not just looking at production as the only indicator within our economy. We need to ensure a green economy and a healthy economy for people, planet, and prosperity. Next slide, please. And we will start to see that the functionality of all of this is the way in which we engage with these different factors. Next. Apologies, but this is an interactive slide and it's not always easy when someone else is directing. So look at resource productivity, look at inclusiveness, look at the way in which we ensure that our economy is servicing the Sustainable Development Goals while enabling us to reach our goals within a planetary boundary lens. Next slide, please. If we take the energy, the food, the poverty, the equality, and the family turnarounds, and these are just some examples of the way in which we look at these key turnarounds. Energy, for example, clearly is shifting the entire energy system and the way in which we depend on a fossil energy system. Food is shifting the entire food system and the way we currently depend on an industrial food system, but also the commodification of food. The fact that we are not steering our food system to ensure access, that we have billions of people going hungry every day, and a total disproportionate amount of others getting obese. There is a dysfunctionality within our current food system. To look at the way in which we address poverty, to look at the way in which we look at the distinction between wealth and well-being, the same with equality. And then, of course, the way in which we address family or demographics, the way in which people can continue to grow within the context of their economy without destabilizing the planet because we have far too many people putting pressure on our precious resources. Next slide, please. Next, there we go. So what we're trying to do, oh, nope, sorry, go back one, is to ensure that we explore the way in which the engagement between these turnarounds will function. We will be publishing next year for the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth and the 50th anniversary of Stockholm+50. We will be publishing not only these turnarounds, but a series of reflections from across the globe, from thought leaders, economists, politicians, as to how we can truly change our current economic models. We know that it is the current economic model and financial model which is underpinning the destabilization of the planet today. We know that we will not be able to decarbonize or to truly look at environmental well-being if we don't bring in social well-being and the way in which people engage with our social and political economies. Next slide, please. And so the key will be to ensure that when we look at these different capitals, that we really shift a thinking around the produced capital, the natural capital, and please just keep on hitting the button and going through this, and the human capital to truly reflect the way in which we want to enhance well-being for the entire planet in the north, in the south, and reduce the destabilization of the current imbalances we see between north and south. Next slide, please. And we're almost getting to the end. So it's to look at the way in which resource productivity can truly enhance our lives and livelihoods. Next, to make sure that the links between the new growth models within the South don't necessarily continue to destabilize the dependency on resources, but create more positive ways of looking at our resources and the way in which we use our resources. Next, please. To ensure that we look at inequality and the pressure points of both aging and family in terms of healthy growth and green growth. Next. And that we address also the fact that well-being economies are not a system error, but actually can be a part of our new future. They are our alternative future. It's the way in which we shift from GDP and growth extraction and a gray growth and an unfair growth into directing all of our capital as well as our resources, our services, to service the right types of value within our economy and our financial system. So we have a healthy planet for healthy people. Next slide, please. Next. That means that we will need to bring into consideration financial assets. And that is the last point on that slide. Our financial system must shift at the same time as our economic system. That will mean not only financing change, which is the current obsession of tripling renewable technology, for example, moving towards energy efficiency technologies, shifting the way in which we look at our economy, circularity, and also regenerative. We need all of that, but we also need to think about changing the financial system from short-term profiteering into a system that truly underpins the right type of values. That is why we need to look at these new economic models. And if you push the next slide, and these are my last two slides, the donut economic model, which enables us to think about the way in which society engages with the planetary boundaries to ensure that actually we meet basic human minimum needs, to ensure dignity. The challenge to actually meet these needs within the planetary boundaries, that no one falls short of life's essentials, food, housing, healthcare, that we don't overshoot on the precious life system that we have and the supporting systems for which and on which we so fundamentally depend. The donut is clearly, as is the well-being economy model, which is the next one, is really the compass for human progress this century. Next slide. So I would truly ask next that we focus on this vision, the 21st century well-being economy with vision, the way in which we underpin that with the regulatory structures that we need that are not just focusing on ensuring that we don't have environmental collapse. Stockholm+50 has to be a signal to humanity that actually the environment, humanity, social necessity is the way in which we will continue to be humans on this planet. Understanding the way in which we fit within all species with the Ubuntu principles that actually we are nature and nature is part of us. It is with these new economic indicators, with these new societal indicators and environmental indicators working fully synergetically that we will achieve the well-being that we need on this planet, and we will build the resilience that we need to avert future pandemics and future crises. So I call upon all of us who will engage in Stockholm+50 to make sure that this is beyond the usual remit of just being about the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Andrine. Very engaging presentation, and we look forward to getting this done and to your report at the Stockholm, or just before the Stockholm+50 conference.
Thank you.
So we will continue with our next speaker. We will have a Q&A session afterwards, so please stay for a little while.
I shall.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Isabella Teixeira, who is from Brazil, and she has been Minister of Environment. And during her tenure, she successfully hosted the Rio Plus 20 conference and has been on Ban Ki-moon's high-level panel of eminent persons for the post-2015 development agenda. She has been credited with having courage to stop the destruction of the environment in Brazil, and has also been recognized by the United Nations Environmental Programme Champions of the Earth Award for Policy Leadership in 2013. Welcome to the Stockholm+49 conference.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to join you today, not only because of the importance of the debate, but also for the opportunity to meet some friends again, even virtually. Okay, but of course, as a former minister and also as today a co-chair of International Resource Panel, if you allow me, I will use the both hats, consider the political challenges to discuss what the planetary boundaries and also the new challenges to deal with the Anthropocene challenges. I'd like to share three different perspectives as food for thoughts, Elena, only to understand better, based on political experience, what are the challenges that we need to manage in short-term perspectives, if I can use this expression. First of all, we need to understand the political context. As Ambassador Juana mentioned, interconnectivity, it's a key asset, or key algorithm, or key passwords to understand better how we move forward. So it's not only between different policies areas, public policy areas, but also between government, civil society, and business. So it's very important to understand how we go into the global aspects to discuss this, and also to manage when you go to discuss environmental governance is the issue that I must approach here today. So 3 or 4 points to be observed. Global crises have increased global skepticism towards multilateralism and international cooperation. This is very important to be observed. So one of the demands is for an invigorated multilateral system to deal with the demand of global development, okay, and their interconnected solutions. It's important to observe, my first observation here, the effects of the networked and inclusive multilateralism as called by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. But is this enough or not? This is something very important. So we have one piece of this global game that is moving. Okay. The second one, humanity and nature. Everyone's here discussed this. It's very important to understand. But there is a connectivity among all nations across a range of issues, not only environmental issues. Okay. And when we discuss geopolitics and also global development interests. Observe, this is very important to be observed because you go deep into this role that's, as the last panelist mentioned, and this is very interesting how to go into this and how we convince people to change. Third, common aspirations are not enough to solve the triple global environmental crisis and rights for a healthy planet, as Inga Anders mentioned, if we move only based on the national interest and only sufficient legal and institutional frameworks as highlighted for the previous panelists. So it's very important to observe this also. The regional, it's not only the global one, but the regional and the clubs, country clubs arrangements for acting in dealing with other adults means other adults into the room. This is very important when you need to discuss international environmental governance, so the new ones that you're looking for to reshape or to shape. Institutions and environmental governance will be demanded to be creative, flexible, actionable, and science-oriented, and to deal with the inequalities, social and environmental ones. Things will come together. And this means to reframe the institutional arrangements that we have today, not only internationally, but also with impacts or reflection into national institutional arrangements. UNEP plus 50 means that you go into multilateral systems, and you need to understand how you reframe UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly, and also if you go to have a better coordination, innovative political understanding with ECOSOC, with G20 and regional blocs. Okay, the domain of the solutions is not necessarily on the countries that have the environmental assets. For example, like the value supply chains domain is not in the commodity producers, not necessarily. Pay attention to this, but this is the reality. Okay, and a specialized science policy interface on the environment. We need to understand this, and we need to reframe how policies come into our decision process, and strengths in an integrate science for informed decision in selected issues. This is very important to observe when you go to discuss interconnectivity and how we go to manage better the political context, to reframe or reshape better, to reshape international environmental governance. A second point here that everyone mentions here, bring people together and be and act together. This is implementation. It's the second I that Ambassador Joanna mentioned, okay? Okay, everyone agrees, okay? Let's be together, let's play together, let's dance together, okay, but when you discuss political inclusion, account diversity as a reality of the world and of nature. Diversity is very important to be observed. We are discussing here, we are going into a non-homogeneous world. Okay, so it's not easy to manage this, and we need to use this as a political asset to reframe our institutional arrangements. Inequalities, it's another issue very important to be observed, must be recognized as part of our historical responsibilities. Our political choice in the past brought us to present. So please recognize this, because if not able to do this, it's impossible to go into Anthropocene new framework and also new sustainable development concept as proposed here today. Share responsibility not based on the rights, but also on obligations. Observe this, okay? The states will manage the global environmental governance as political rules to address national interests. These perspectives seem to be insufficient to act based on shared responsibilities and common values and partnership to tackle global environmental crises. It seems crucial to take into account the regional cooperation to rearrange the national interests to achieve global co-benefits. A good example, we need to bring the countries that share Amazon basin together. This is regional cooperation in an innovative way. But if you use the lens of international cooperation that you have today, these countries, they are middle-income countries, they are not hosted by the international cooperation mechanism. But if you go into the region, the Amazon region, the indicators means that we have low-income countries. So you need to review how we approach, how we use the lens to bring people together and to have blocks or regional action to come based on nature, but to use the political and economic assets and also social challenges. So my feeling here, my last point in this block, I'm going to the third one, Elena. Global crisis is relevant to separate pressure from change, to rebuild the confidence between developed and developing countries, okay, in the world. The innovative role of the South society should play must be observed or considered or discussed, not only when you consider the traditional North and South relationship, but also considering the dynamics of the world, the Eastern and the Western world coming together. It's very important to observe this, okay? My third block, my last comment here, exactly challenges for the environmental governance. And one of the key aspects, in my opinion, is to overcoming the short-termism that I think that Maria Fernanda mentioned this before. So you are discussing planetary perspectives. We are coming from global perspectives in my first block to this planetary perspectives in the third block. Be planetary, not global. This is the big challenge, okay? This is really the big political challenge that we need to face, okay? And the human civilization is in the process of trying to become like Earth, in the sense of learning to become a persistent system, as Stuart Brand used to say. Yes, but we need to be realistic also. In this century, we are going to get a lot of harsh lessons. You have this, as explained before, on how not to persist. Global crisis, we are going either to correct that or not. This is the option that you need to take the next year, or the process that you need to face in this decade that you named transition decade. The need to add, also we need to add a dose of humanism. It's important because it's not only the realism. We need to bring humanism reflecting more thoughtful ideas and shared values. So we need to repact a new expression, a new moment of humanism and solidarity in the world. We need to be fact-based, not belief-based. This is something that happened in the past. You agree with the science, but you are not able to act in the last 30 years as you need to act because exactly of the conditions of the beliefs. It is very important to observe this. Rights, but also obligations, as I mentioned before. The construction of change is democratic. Pay attention, observe this. We need democracy. And observe what's happening today in the world, considering the emergence of political movements against or to damage or to weaken democracy around the world. Be more proactive, less reactive. This is very important also. The importance to change now to have a better future. So the decisions must happen now, okay? The intergeneration and solidarity, as Joanna mentioned also in her presentation. Supporting global preparedness and resilience building for the future crisis. This is very important for the new environmental governance. Fielding more effective, integrated response, security, and potentially connected crises. You need to learn what is happening, for example, what's happening with pandemic crisis. And you need to work hard supporting global preparedness process and resilience. So my last comment here, exactly based on my reality in my country, what is happening today in Brazil, how environmental governance is very important to be reframed, reshaped, and to be highlighted as a key aspect for the global debate. Then what is happening in Brazil today is exactly how, in short-term perspective, the government stopped all the trajectory based on environmental institution and our environmental policy and science-oriented. So you have a governance crisis in environmental systems, and all that you face today, it's really, really important to understand that it's not to rebuild the past, but building new bases, building new concerns, building new political alliances, build on contemporaneity. So, but it's very important also to observe the reaction of the Brazilian society today. We are playing in different perspectives. We are playing not only to go against, but we are based exactly oriented to face future and to bring the future to the present. That's why it's happened today when you have the Concertação for Amazonia, when you have for Amazon region, when you have other coalitions of the civil society and science close today to discuss, for example, the new economy to stand up for us. This really, really means that we have the power as civil society to move forward, not only to put pressure, but to be transformative. So believe in our capacity to be transformative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Teixeira. You have touched on a number of very key important questions here, and I would like to pose one question as to kick off our Q&A session. What would you say are the main obstacles to getting bold action at the global level?
I'm sorry, it's for me?
Yes, for you.
I'm sorry, I can't. Would you mind to repeat? I cannot hear you. Sorry.
What would you say are the obstacles to getting bold action at the global level?
Oh, the obstacles. We have, first of all, I think that we need to have a common understanding based on the grounds of some key societies or key countries that must have a convergence and must play together. I'll give you an example. When we discuss climate change, you have the driver of energy that is very important. But when you go into the developing world, like South America and the Africa countries, the importance of land use agenda is coming in the new perspectives. So it is not only the nature positive agriculture that we have been discussing the last 2 years, but also how we address food security based on climate resilience. This is a clear way that we need to bring, for example, international trade constituents to discuss about the value chains and to understand what are the new choices that make clear to remove the obstacles to bring people together. You need to go into these different constituents, as Sabine mentioned before. We need to understand what are the local challenges and what are the barriers, the bottlenecks that short-term perspectives will impose to us, and we need to convince people that we have the power of choice. So it's not only based on what we believe, but it's based on the realities and to understand the trade-offs of short-term perspectives in such a way that you can manage better this agenda and convince people and bring the countries and big economy driving into the new perspectives considering planetary boundaries. My feeling and my experience shows that we need to pray for non-converted people in short-term perspective. We need to use new political language. We need to have open dialogue rooms to understand the trade-offs, and of course use legal requirements or legal tools and really new aspiration, what we need to do to go beyond the challenge of short-term perspectives. This is very important. Trade-offs in short-term perspective must be one of the key issues to be addressed if you want to bring the future to the present. This is based on my experience and consider, for example, land use challenge and the fight against deforestation in the past in Brazil.
Thank you. I will pose the same question to Sandrine Dixon de Clercq. What do you think are the challenges to getting bold action at a global level?
So I think there are multiple levels of challenges, but I agree with Isabella that the key challenge is that we have continued short-term political cycles, that we don't have actually either our policymakers, whether they be at the international level, national level, regional level, or local level, who are enabled to think long-term, because the way in which we have structured our socio-political economy is around short-termism. And we cannot continue to function within a short-term cycle. The planet does not enable us to, and humanity does not enable us to. So we need brave leadership to start to shift this cycle. Now, what it does when you start to think about long-term planning is, unfortunately, again, it gets politicized. Oh, well, that's the Chinese model, or that's a certain political model. And it's not. It's what humanity needs to survive on this planet. So first, let's think about short-termism as one of the key barriers. Second, then, let's see what are the short-term levers, however, that enable us to get to long-term systems thinking. And within that context, we can start to look at, for example, placing environmental, social, and human value within our underlying budgets across the board, placing a value on, again, human life, social, and environmental factors in the way in which we structure our economies. That can be done as short-term levers, whether it be budgetary levers, whether it be in the way in which we call upon both state investment and private investment through regulatory shifts. So we will have to already now be clever enough to place those type of levers in so that they start to enable us to build the resilience and the long-term system shifts that we need.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have also a question for Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa. At the local level, we see no connection between comments and reality so far. How to make or transform the commitments as mandatory, not false?
Well, thank you, Elena, and thank you to the person who addressed this question. And basically, in these disconnections that we've been discussing, I think it is not only a disconnection between the times of politics and the times of nature and long-term planning, as Sandrine was mentioning, but also a scale disconnect. I say this as a geographer, and I think that we can do more and better to make sure that innovation at the local community level, innovation by local governments, by cities, scale up into informing national policy and national decision-making and regulatory frameworks at the national level. And at the same time, how this, impacts and transforms discussions at the global level. So it's a two-way, mutually reinforcing process where you scale up, but also when you take international norm setting and you inform and improve performance at the local level. In my experience, innovation, good practices, resilience do happen at the local level, do happen at the local government level. And I think we need better mechanisms and better means to make sure that these local experiences inform global decision making. And I think we would be much better off. And sometimes legal exercises and norm setting happen from a very top-down approach, and it doesn't help. The only way to make sure that we close the implementation gap is by social ownership of the decisions we make. So this social ownership is critical as we speak and as we prepare for the Stockholm+50 summit. I think it's very important to hear the voices of local leaders, to hear the voices of civil society in all its diversity, to hear the voices and the commitment of the private sector. And of course, as Isabella said it so clearly, this is about rights and shared responsibilities. Thank you, and back to you, Elena.
I have a follow-up question for you, because you said something that I think is really powerful in your speech, which was that our current situation is that our wealth and well-being can only be realized through systematic destruction of our natural resources. How do we change that?
Well, basically, I think the very understanding of growth and development is from a reactive post facto kind of economic thinking. You know, the way, for example, we compensate for what we have already done, and we restore and compensate for the already made emissions. I think that we need to strongly exercise the preventive approach, the precautionary principle. This was top rated and top listed in the principles that so many of you today mentioned. You know, when we are thinking about a new international global governance, a new international environmental law that would understand and reflect the challenges of the 21st century. This is critical, for example, when we understand the discussions on mitigation and adaptation in the climate negotiations. Mitigation is important, but adaptation is equally important. How to be, how to build resilience, how to adapt better at the same time as we reduce emissions. And a long time ago, Ecuador came up with a, I would say, a groundbreaking initiative of a compensation mechanism for not doing, to not exploit oil in a core biodiversity area in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And that, didn't flourish because the time was not right. But I think that today the time is ripe to really think about a concept, which is the concept of avoided net emission, based on the precautionary principle. And if someone is interested, I'll be more than happy to share what avoided net emissions is. So new economic thinking, a new development paradigm, not only, based on growth and profit, but based on values and on survival, both survival of the human species, but also survival of our Earth system.
Thank you very much, Dr. Espinosa. We are running out of time, unfortunately. So we don't have time for more questions, although there are a few from the audience. We'll try to answer that later on if possible. But we would like to remind you, we should have a short coffee break now, but we will go over to the next session in a minute. But for those, all of you who are participating, there will be a link popping up in a minute, or maybe it's already there, where you can access, where you can have comments or proposed changes in this one pager that we talked about during the session.
Yes.
So very welcome to join us in the co-creation of the one pager. And thank you very much from Stockholm for today, from us at least. We will hand over to the next speakers.
Thank you very much, Eliana. And
Thank
Stanley,
you.
bye, Maria Fernanda, bye,
Bye.
Sandrine, bye.
Thank you.
Bye, my
Bye-bye. See you
sister
soon.
Isabella. Bye, Elena. Bye,
I'm going
Stanley.
to
Bye,
COP26.
Isabella. Bye.
Bye, Sandrine. You need to
Bye,
talk.
Maria.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
we need to
Good to see you
You need to
all.
talk. It's there. You're going to Glasgow. You're going to meet there. Okay. You need
Yes.
to talk. I'm
We
going to be
will.
there. Very important
Good.
to discuss Amazon. Sandrine, I need you and Maria. You need to be closer to have informal dialogue for the audience to understand how politics indeed is real. Okay, this is the real world that's looking for to address concrete solutions. This is part of this arrangement. So let's do it.
Agreed.
Okay. See you next week. Bye bye. Thank you, Elena.
See you,
Thank you, Stanley.
everyone.
Thank
Congratulations.
you.
Glasgow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.